It was a quiet evening in the small town of Ridgewood, Ohio. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the occasional chirping of crickets and the distant hum of cars passing by. Officer Kevin Doyle sat in his patrol car, sipping coffee from a paper cup as he scanned the area. He had been on the force for over 15 years, and this shift felt like any other. Boring, routine, uneventful. But deep down, Doyle wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed peace. He liked action, authority, and control. And tonight, that craving would lead to disaster. Doyle's radio crackled with updates from dispatch, but nothing caught his attention until he spotted a sedan slowing down at a stop sign ahead. It wasn't speeding or behaving erratically, but something about it made him narrow his eyes. The car was old, its paint faded, and the driver appeared to be an older black man. Without much thought, Doyle flipped on his flashing lights and pulled the vehicle over. Marcus Johnson, the driver, sighed heavily as he eased the car onto the shoulder. He'd had a long day, visiting his granddaughter's school for parent-teacher night, and all he wanted now was to get home and relax. As he rolled down his window, he glanced into the rearview mirror and saw the officer approaching. Marcus adjusted his posture, sitting up straighter. He had learned over the years how to handle situations like this. Stay calm, respectful, and cooperative. "Good evening, sir," Marcus said politely as Doyle leaned down to peer into the car. "Is there a problem?" Doyle didn't return the greeting. Instead, he shone his flashlight directly into Marcus's face, momentarily blinding him. "License and registration," Doyle barked, his tone sharp and accusatory. Marcus blinked against the glare and reached slowly for his wallet. He knew better than to make sudden movements around police officers. Pulling out his license, he handed it over along with the car's registration. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" he asked calmly. "You've got a busted taillight." Doyle replied curtly, though he hadn't actually checked. His gut told him there was something off about this guy, and his instincts rarely led him wrong, or so he believed. Marcus frowned slightly. "A busted taillight? I'll have to check that when I get home. I haven't noticed anything wrong." "Well, maybe you should pay more attention to your car," Doyle snapped, his voice dripping with condescension. He stepped back and ran, the information through his system while keeping one hand resting on the grip of his holstered gun. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like standard procedure, but Doyle's body language screamed hostility. Minutes passed in tense silence. When the records came back clean, Doyle scowled. No warrants, no priors, just a retired Army major living a quiet life. Still, something about Marcus rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, exuding confidence without arrogance, or maybe it was the fact that Marcus didn't seem intimidated by him. Whatever it was, Doyle couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to assert dominance. "Step out of the vehicle," Doyle ordered suddenly, his voice rising. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Why? Is there a reason I need to exit my car?" "I said step out," Doyle repeated louder this time. His patience was wearing thin, and his temper flared. Reluctantly, Marcus opened the door and stepped onto the pavement. He kept his hands, visible, clasped loosely in front of him. "Officer, is there a specific issue here? Because if not, I'd really like to go home." Doyle ignored the question. Instead, he took a step closer, his hand now gripping the handle of his gun. "You think you're smart, don't you, talking back like that?" "I'm not talking back," Marcus said firmly, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "I'm simply asking for clarification. I know my rights, and I'm entitled to understand why I'm being detained." That comment struck a nerve. Doyle's jaw clenched, and his grip tightened on his weapon. "Your rights? You want to talk?" "About rights. How about the right to keep people like you in line?" The words hung heavy in the air. Marcus stared at him, disbelief etched across his face. "People like me? What does that mean exactly?" Before Doyle could respond, headlights appeared in the distance. A car slowed down nearby, and a young woman leaned out her window, holding up her phone. "Is everything okay here?" she called out. "I'm recording this." Doyle hesitated, glancing at the phone. For a moment his bravado faltered. Then he turned back to Marcus, his expression hardening. "Get on the ground!" he shouted, drawing his gun fully. "Now!" Marcus didn't move. He stood tall, meeting Doyle's gaze with unwavering resolve. "No," he said simply. "I haven't done anything wrong." The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Another car pulled up behind the first, and soon several phones were pointed at the scene. Voices echoed through the night, some shouting encouragement to Marcus, others demanding answers from Doyle. The situation spiraled out of control, and before long, backup arrived, sirens wailing. By then, the video footage had already spread online. Within hours, hashtags like True Justice for Marcus and Usher End Police Brutality began trending. People across the country watched in outrage as Doyle's aggressive behavior played out on their screens. What started as a routine traffic stop had become a national incident, shining a harsh spotlight on the systemic issues plaguing law enforcement. As the dust settled, Marcus stood quietly, his dignity intact. He didn't raise his voice or lash out. He simply waited for the chaos to subside, knowing full well that this moment would change lives, including his own. Meanwhile, Doyle retreated to his patrol car, seething with anger and denial. He couldn't comprehend how things had gone so wrong so fast. All he knew was that his world was about to come crashing down around him. The stage was set for a reckoning, one that would test the limits of justice, redemption, and humanity itself. The sun rose over Ridgewood the next morning, but it brought no warmth to Kevin Doyle. He sat slumped in his kitchen chair, staring at the television screen as news anchors dissected the incident from the night before. The video of him confronting Marcus Johnson had gone viral, and every channel seemed to be playing it on repeat. Reporters described him as aggressive, unprofessional, and racist. His face filled the screen, frozen in a moment of anger that now defined him. Linda, Doyle's wife, stood by the counter, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She hadn't said much since coming home late last night after picking up their teenage daughter, Sarah, from a sleepover. Now she finally broke the silence. "Kevin, what were you thinking?" Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a mix of disappointment and frustration. Doyle looked up, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "I was doing my job," he muttered defensively. "That guy didn't belong in this neighborhood. Something about him wasn't right." Linda shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You can't just pull someone over because of how they look or where they're driving. That's not your job. It's profiling, plain and simple." "It's not profiling," Doyle snapped, slamming his fist on the table. "I saw a broken taillight. That's all it was. But then he started mouthing off, acting like he was better than me." "Better than you?" Linda repeated, her voice rising. "He's a retired Army major, Kevin, a decorated veteran, and you treated him like a criminal." Doyle leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his thinning hair. He didn't want to hear this. Not from her, not from anyone. Deep down, though, he knew she was right. He had let his emotions take over, and now the whole world was watching. "It doesn't matter what I did," he said bitterly. "They've already decided I'm guilty." Linda sighed, dropping onto the couch across from him. "You brought this on yourself. You've always had a chip on your shoulder when it comes to certain people." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I've tried to ignore it, but maybe I shouldn't have." Her words stung more than Doyle cared to admit. For years he had brushed off complaints from colleagues and citizens alike, dismissing them as exaggerations or misunderstandings. But now those same grievances were resurfacing, painting a damning picture of his conduct over the years. Internal affairs investigators were digging into his record, pulling up old cases and interviewing past victims. Every accusation, no matter how minor, was being scrutinized under a microscope. At work, things weren't any better. When Doyle reported for duty later that day, he could feel the stares burning into him. His fellow officers avoided eye contact, pretending to be busy whenever he walked by. Even Captain Harris, who had always been supportive of Doyle, kept his distance. The precinct buzzed with whispers, everyone speculating about what would happen next. Doyle tried to focus on paperwork, but his mind kept drifting back to the video. He replayed it in his head, analyzing every word, every movement. Had he really sounded that angry? That unreasonable? The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. Not at himself, but at everyone else. They didn't understand. They didn't see what he saw. By mid-afternoon, protesters began gathering outside the precinct. Dozens of people held signs, demanding justice for Marcus Johnson and calling for reforms within the police department. Some chanted slogans. Others stood silently, holding candles in solidarity. Doyle watched from behind the blinds in the break room, his stomach churning. He hated crowds, especially when they were directed against him. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. Social media exploded with hashtags like Fire Doyle and Accountability Now. Celebrities and activists joined the conversation, amplifying calls for change. Local politicians weighed in, promising investigations and policy reviews. The entire town seemed divided, some defending Doyle as a scapegoat, others condemning him as a symbol of systemic racism. Meanwhile, Marcus Johnson became a household name. Interviews with him aired on national television, where he spoke eloquently about his experience and the need for reform. He emphasized forgiveness and understanding, refusing to vilify Doyle outright. "I don't hate Officer Doyle," he said during one interview. "But I do believe he needs help, and so does our system. This isn't just about one man. It's about addressing the biases and fears that drive these kinds of interactions." His words resonated with many, earning him widespread admiration. People began organizing community meetings to discuss ways to improve relations between law, enforcement, and marginalized groups. Schools invited Marcus to speak to students about resilience and standing up for what's right. Despite the trauma of the encounter, he chose to use his platform for good, inspiring hope in those who felt powerless. While Marcus thrived in the spotlight, Doyle sank deeper into despair. His drinking increased, and he spent most nights alone in front of the TV, numbing himself with alcohol. Linda grew increasingly distant, spending more time with Sarah and less with him. One evening, she finally confronted him again. "This has to stop, Kevin," she said firmly. "You're destroying yourself and us." "I'm not the one who did anything wrong," Doyle shot back, his words slurred. "They're tearing me apart for doing my job." "No, you're tearing yourself apart," Linda replied. "And if you don't get help, we're leaving." Her tone left no room for argument. For the first time, Doyle felt truly scared. Losing his badge was one thing, but losing his family, that was unthinkable. Yet as the weeks dragged on, it became clear that he might lose both. His suspension without pay left him financially strained, and the mounting legal fees only added to the stress. Friends stopped returning his calls, and even his parents refused to defend him publicly. One night, after another round of scathing headlines, Doyle hit rock bottom. He stumbled out of the house, desperate for fresh air, and ended up at a local bar. As he nursed his drink, a stranger approached him, a middle-aged man named Greg, who introduced himself as a pastor. "You look like you could use someone to talk to," Greg said gently, sliding into the seat beside him. Doyle hesitated, unsure whether to trust this stranger, but something about Greg's calm demeanor put him at ease. Slowly, haltingly, he began to open up. He talked about the traffic stop, the backlash, the shame. Greg listened patiently, nodding occasionally, but never interrupting. By the end of the conversation, Doyle felt a flicker of relief, a tiny crack in the wall of denial he had built around himself. Greg handed him a card with his contact information. "If you ever want to talk more, I run a shelter downtown. We help folks get back on their feet. No judgment, just support." Doyle stared at the card, unsure what to make of it. But as he walked home that night, he realized he had no other options. If he wanted to salvage anything from the wreckage of his life, he would have to start somewhere. And maybe, just maybe, Greg could point him in the right direction. The road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with challenges and uncertainties. But for the first time in weeks, Doyle allowed himself to consider the possibility of change, even if it meant facing truths he had spent a lifetime avoiding. The legal battle began in earnest a few weeks after the incident. Marcus Johnson, now represented by attorney Emily Dawson, filed a lawsuit against both Kevin Doyle and the Ridgewood Police Department. The case quickly gained national attention, drawing support from civil rights organizations, activists, and ordinary citizens who saw it as an opportunity for real change. For Marcus, the decision to take legal action wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. He wanted to ensure that what happened to him wouldn't happen to anyone else. Emily Dawson was known for her sharp mind and relentless pursuit of justice. She had spent years fighting for marginalized communities, taking on cases that others deemed too risky or unwinnable. When she first met Marcus, she was struck by his calm demeanor and unwavering determination. "Mr. Johnson," she said during their initial meeting, "this isn't just about you. It's about sending a message that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I don't want this to divide people further," he replied. "If we can turn this into something positive, something that brings us closer together, then maybe some good can come out of it." With that goal in mind, Emily got to work. She dug deep into Doyle's record, uncovering a pattern of discriminatory behavior that shocked even her. There were complaints dating back years, accusations of racial profiling, excessive force, and verbal abuse, all dismissed or ignored by internal affairs. Witnesses came forward sharing stories of similar encounters with Doyle. Some had been too afraid to speak up at the time, but now, emboldened by Marcus's courage, they were ready to testify. As preparations for the trial intensified, so did the public scrutiny. News outlets covered every development, dissecting evidence and interviewing experts. Social media buzzed with debates about policing, systemic racism, and reform. Protesters continued to gather outside the precinct, their numbers growing each week. Signs reading "Justice for Marcus" and "End Police Brutality" lined the streets, turning the small town into a symbol of resistance. For Doyle, the mounting pressure felt suffocating. He attended depositions reluctantly, his answers defensive and often contradictory. When asked why he had drawn his gun on Marcus, he struggled to provide a coherent explanation. He was being uncooperative, Doyle insisted, his voice tinged with frustration. "I couldn't take any chances." "But Mr. Johnson was calm and compliant throughout the interaction, correct?" Emily pressed, her tone firm but measured. In fact, multiple witnesses confirmed that he posed no threat whatsoever. Doyle shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It's not always about what someone does," he muttered. "Sometimes it's about what they might do." Emily raised an eyebrow. "So you acted based on assumption rather than evidence?" Doyle hesitated, realizing too late how damaging his words sounded. "That's not what I meant," he stammered. But the damage was done. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of his admission hanging heavy in the air. Back at home, Doyle's personal life continued to unravel. Linda had moved out, taking Sarah with her. They stayed with her sister while she figured out their next steps. Doyle begged her to reconsider, promising to change, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. "You don't understand, Kevin," she told him one evening over the phone. "This isn't just about what happened that night. It's about everything. The anger, the prejudice, the way you've pushed people away. I can't keep living like this." Her words cut deeper than anything else. Doyle had always prided himself on being a provider, a protector. But now he realized he had failed the very people he claimed to care about most. Alone in his apartment, surrounded by empty beer bottles and unpaid bills, he sank into despair. Nights blurred into days as he tried to numb the pain with alcohol, but nothing could silence the voice inside his head telling him he deserved this. One evening, desperate for distraction, Doyle decided to visit the shelter where Pastor Greg worked. He still carried Greg's card in his wallet, though he hadn't intended to use it. Something about the pastor's kindness during their brief encounter stuck with him, a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak existence. When Doyle arrived, Greg greeted him warmly, recognizing him immediately. Glad you made it, he said, gesturing for Doyle to follow him inside. The shelter was bustling with activity. Volunteers serving meals, families settling into temporary housing, children playing in a corner. Despite the chaos, there was a sense of purpose, of community. Greg led Doyle to a quiet room where they could talk. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently, pouring them each a cup of coffee. Doyle shrugged, staring at the floor. "Not great," he admitted. "Everything's falling apart. My job, my family, my reputation. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be able to fix it." "You can't fix everything overnight," Greg replied. "But you can start by being honest with yourself and others. That's the first step toward healing." Doyle nodded slowly, unsure where to begin. For so long he had buried his feelings, convincing himself that his actions were justified. Now, faced with undeniable proof of his mistakes, he didn't know how to move forward. "I don't even know who I am anymore," he confessed. "Am I really the monster everyone says I am?" "No one is born a monster," Greg said firmly. "We all have biases and fears. They're part of being human. But it's what we do with them that defines us. You've got a choice, Kevin. You can let this break you, or you can use it as an opportunity to grow." His words lingered in Doyle's mind long after their conversation ended. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to consider the possibility of redemption. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, apologies that went unanswered, bridges that couldn't be rebuilt. But maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to make amends. Meanwhile, Marcus focused on turning his newfound platform into meaningful action. Inspired by the overwhelming support he received, he partnered with local leaders to launch a community outreach program aimed at fostering trust between residents and law enforcement. The initiative included workshops, town hall meetings, and mentorship opportunities designed to address systemic issues head-on. At one such event, Marcus stood before a packed auditorium, speaking passionately about the importance of dialogue and understanding. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said. "It takes time, effort, and a willingness to listen. We won't always agree, and that's okay. What matters is that we keep talking, keep working toward a better future for ourselves and for generations to come." His words resonated deeply with the crowd, earning thunderous applause. Among the attendees was Daniel Johnson, Marcus's estranged son. Their relationship had been strained for years, marked by misunderstandings and unresolved tension. But seeing his father stand tall, advocating for unity and progress, reignited something in Daniel. After the event, he approached Marcus cautiously, unsure how he'd be received. "Dad," Daniel began, his voice tentative. I'm proud of you. Everything you've done. It's incredible." Marcus smiled, his eyes softening. "Thank you, son. That means more than you know." He paused, studying Daniel's face. "We've had our differences, but I think it's time we worked through them. Together." Daniel nodded, relief washing over him. "I'd like that." As father and son embraced, a sense of closure settled over them. Though scars remained, they found solace in the knowledge that they could heal, together. Back at the precinct, reforms were already underway. Pressure from the lawsuit and public outcry forced Captain Harris to implement new training programs focused on bias recognition and de-escalation techniques. Oversight committees were established to review officer conduct and address complaints promptly. While some officers grumbled about the changes, others welcomed them, recognizing the need for improvement. For Doyle, however, the road ahead remained uncertain. His suspension without pay left him financially strapped, and his attempts to reconnect with Linda and Sarah yielded mixed results. Still, he continued attending counseling sessions at the shelter, slowly confronting the prejudices that had shaped his worldview. Each session was painful, forcing him to acknowledge truths he had long ignored. Yet with each revelation came a glimmer of hope, a reminder that growth was possible even in the darkest moments. The trial loomed on the horizon, its outcome unknown. But for Marcus, the journey was about more than winning or losing. It was about sparking change, inspiring others to demand better, not just from law enforcement but from society as a whole. And for Doyle, it was about facing his demons, taking responsibility for his actions, and finding a way to rebuild, not just his career, but his humanity. Though their paths diverged, both men understood one thing: justice was complex, messy, and often imperfect, but it was worth fighting for. The trial began on a cold, gray morning in Ridgewood. The courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters scribbling notes, activists holding signs, and curious townspeople eager to witness history unfold. Marcus Johnson sat quietly beside his attorney, Emily Dawson, his expression calm but resolute. Across the aisle, Kevin Doyle fidgeted nervously, his face pale and drawn. He glanced around the room, avoiding eye contact with anyone, especially Marcus. As the proceedings got underway, the atmosphere was tense. Emily opened her case by presenting evidence of Doyle's discriminatory behavior over the years. She called witnesses who recounted their own harrowing experiences with him, traffic stops that escalated unnecessarily, rude comments made under the guise of authority, and instances where he used excessive force. Each story painted a picture of an officer who abused his power, targeting individuals based on race rather than legitimate suspicion. Doyle listened silently as person after person described encounters eerily similar to Marcus's. A young black man named Jordan spoke about being pulled over for no reason other than driving through a predominantly white neighborhood. "He told me I didn't belong there," Jordan said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I wasn't breaking any laws, but he treated me like a criminal." Another witness, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, recalled how Doyle had shouted at her teenage son during a routine stop. "My boy was scared out of his mind," she said, tears streaming down her face. Officer Doyle accused him of stealing a car when all he'd done was borrow mine. Each testimony added weight to Marcus's lawsuit, exposing systemic issues. Within the police department, Captain Harris, called to testify, admitted reluctantly that complaints against Doyle had been mishandled. "We should have addressed these concerns earlier," he said, shifting uncomfortably in the witness stand. "It's clear now that our oversight failed." When it was Doyle's turn to testify, he struggled to defend himself. His answers were defensive and disjointed, betraying the cracks in his facade. When Emily asked why he hadn't followed proper protocol during Marcus's traffic stop, he hesitated before mumbling, "I thought I saw something suspicious." But pressed further, he couldn't articulate what exactly had raised his suspicions beyond vague references to gut feelings and instincts. Emily seized the opportunity to highlight the flaws in his reasoning. "So you acted based on assumptions rather than facts?" she asked pointedly. I guess so," Doyle admitted reluctantly, his voice barely audible. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and even Judge Miller, known for maintaining strict decorum, looked troubled. For many in attendance, this admission confirmed what they already suspected. Doyle's actions stemmed from deep-seated biases, not professional judgment. Outside the courthouse, the community rallied together. Protesters held vigils, demanding accountability not just for Doyle but for all officers guilty of misconduct. Local leaders organized workshops aimed at fostering dialogue between law enforcement and marginalized groups. Marcus became a central figure in these efforts, using his platform to advocate for reform. He spoke passionately about the importance of trust, transparency, and mutual respect. "We can't move forward unless we address the root causes of these problems," he told a crowd gathered at a town hall meeting. "It's not enough to punish bad actors. We need to create systems that prevent abuse of power in the first place." His words resonated deeply with those who had long felt ignored or mistreated by authorities. People began sharing their own stories, finding strength in solidarity. Slowly but surely, bridges started to form where walls once stood. For Doyle, the trial marked the beginning of a painful reckoning. As damning evidence mounted against him, he realized the full extent of the damage he had caused, not only to Marcus but to countless others whose lives he had disrupted. Late one night, unable to sleep, he found himself scrolling through old news articles about the incident. Comment sections were filled with vitriol, calling him everything from a disgrace to a monster. Some posts suggested he deserved worse than losing his badge. Others expressed hope that he would learn from his mistakes. Doyle closed his laptop, overwhelmed by shame. He wanted to believe he could change, but doubt gnawed at him. Would anyone forgive him? Could he ever forgive himself? These questions haunted him as he continued attending counseling sessions at Greg's shelter. Over time, he began opening up more, sharing pieces of his past he had kept hidden even from himself. I grew up hearing certain things about people who didn't look like me, he confessed during one session. Back then, I didn't question them, it was just how things were, but now I see how wrong I was. Greg nodded encouragingly. Acknowledging your biases is hard work, Kevin. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. Keep going, you're making progress. Though slow, the changes in Doyle were noticeable. He stopped drinking as heavily, replaced bitterness with reflection, and started volunteering regularly at the shelter. At first, he kept to himself, unsure how others would react to him. But gradually, he formed connections with fellow volunteers and shelter residents, learning to see them not as stereotypes but as individuals with unique struggles and strengths. Meanwhile, Marcus focused on rebuilding relationships closer to home. Reconnecting with Daniel had been a turning point, allowing both father and son to confront years of unresolved tension. They spent evenings talking about everything: childhood memories, missed opportunities, dreams for the future. Through these conversations, they discovered common ground and a renewed sense of purpose. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Daniel turned to Marcus. "Dad, do you ever feel like maybe none of this will make a difference? Like, no matter how hard we try, some things will never change?" Marcus smiled softly, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he replied, "but every step counts. Even if we don't see immediate results, we're planting seeds. Someday, someone else will water them, and they'll grow into something beautiful." Daniel nodded, comforted by his father's wisdom. Together, they vowed to keep pushing forward, knowing the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but believing it was worth the effort. Back in court, closing arguments brought the trial to its climax. Emily delivered a powerful speech reminding the jury of the stakes involved. "This isn't just about one man or one incident," she said. "It's about holding institutions accountable and ensuring justice for everyone, regardless of race or background. Let this verdict send a message that we won't tolerate prejudice or abuse of power." Doyle's lawyer countered by arguing that his client's actions, while misguided, did not warrant such severe consequences. Officer Doyle made a mistake, a serious one, but he is not beyond redemption, the defense attorney pleaded. "Let us focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment." After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty. Doyle was stripped of his badge permanently and ordered to undergo mandatory counseling and perform community service. While some viewed the punishment as lenient, others saw it as a chance for genuine transformation. For Marcus, the outcome was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but scars remained. Still, he chose to focus on the positives: the reforms sparked by the case, the unity it inspired, and the hope it instilled in communities across the nation. As he left the courthouse that day, surrounded by supporters, he felt a sense of peace, knowing he had made a difference. Across town, Doyle reflected on the road ahead. Redemption wouldn't come easily, but he was determined to try. Volunteering at the shelter gave him a glimpse of what true compassion looked like, and he resolved to embody that spirit moving forward. Though uncertain, his path offered a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even in darkness, light could still shine through. The story of Marcus Johnson and Kevin Doyle wasn't just about two men. It was about humanity itself. Flawed, imperfect, yet capable of growth and change. And as the town of Ridgewood began healing, its people carried with them a shared belief that justice, though complex, was always worth pursuing. The verdict was a turning point for everyone involved, but the aftermath was far from simple. For Kevin Doyle, life became a daily struggle to rebuild what he had lost, or at least salvage whatever pieces remained. Stripped of his badge and ordered to serve community service, he found himself in unfamiliar territory. No longer the authority figure with a gun and a uniform, he was now just another face in the crowd, often met with stares or whispers when recognized. Doyle's first day of mandatory volunteering at Greg's shelter was daunting. He arrived early, dressed in plain clothes that felt strange against his skin. The weight of his past hung over him like a shadow, making every step toward the shelter door feel heavier than it should have been. Inside, the air smelled faintly of bleach and coffee, and the hum of activity filled the space. Volunteers bustled around, preparing meals, organizing donations, and helping residents find temporary housing. Greg greeted him warmly, as always, but there was a cautiousness in his tone. "You'll be working in the kitchen today," he said, handing Doyle an apron. "Just follow along with the others, they'll show you what to do." Doyle nodded, tying the apron awkwardly around his waist. As he stepped into the kitchen, he noticed the curious glances from other volunteers. Some avoided eye contact altogether, while others gave him polite smiles before quickly looking away. A young woman named Rachel, who had been volunteering at the shelter for years, approached him hesitantly. "Hi," she said softly. "I'm Rachel. I'll be showing you how things work here." Doyle forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks," he muttered, feeling out of place. Rachel led him through the basics, chopping vegetables, stirring pots of soup, and packing meals into containers for distribution. At first, Doyle moved stiffly, unsure of himself. His hands fumbled, with tasks that seemed second nature to everyone else. But as the hours passed, he began to relax slightly, finding rhythm in the repetitive motions. It wasn't redemption, not by any means, but it was something, a small step toward making amends. Later that afternoon, Greg pulled Doyle aside. "How's it going?" he asked gently. "It's different," Doyle admitted. "I'm not used to this kind of work. Feels weird." Greg chuckled softly. "It takes time to adjust. Don't be too hard on yourself. You're doing better than you think." Doyle sighed, leaning against the counter. "I don't know if I'll ever make up for what I've done. People look at me like I'm scum." "That's because they see your actions, not the person behind them," Greg replied. "But actions can change. Keep showing up, keep putting in the effort, and eventually people will notice." Though Greg's words offered some comfort, Doyle couldn't shake the feeling of being judged. Every glance, every whispered conversation felt like a reminder of his failures. Still, he returned to the shelter the next day, and the day after that. Slowly, he started forming connections with the volunteers and shelter residents. One man, a former construction worker named Carl, who had fallen on hard times, struck up a conversation with him one evening. "You were a cop, huh?" Carl asked, sitting beside Doyle during a meal break. Doyle tensed, bracing himself for criticism. "Yeah, not anymore." Carl shrugged. "Don't matter to me what you did before. What matters is what you're doing now. And so far you seem all right." For the first time in months, Doyle felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could earn back some trust, not all at once, but little by little. Meanwhile, Marcus Johnson continued his mission to foster unity and understanding within Ridgewood. The reforms sparked by the trial were beginning to take shape, with new training programs implemented across the police department. Officers attended workshops focused on bias recognition, de-escalation techniques, and cultural sensitivity. Some embraced the changes enthusiastically, while others grumbled about political correctness. But the overall impact was undeniable. Marcus worked closely with Captain Harris to ensure accountability measures stayed in place. Oversight committees reviewed officer conduct regularly, addressing complaints promptly and transparently. Community meetings became a regular occurrence, providing a platform for residents to voice concerns directly to law enforcement. These efforts helped bridge gaps that had long divided the town, fostering dialogue where silence once prevailed. At home, Marcus deepened his bond with Daniel. Their relationship had transformed from strained and distant to open and supportive. Daniel joined his father at several community events, inspired by his dedication to creating positive change. Together, they visited schools, spoke at rallies, and mentored young people eager to make a difference. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Daniel turned to Marcus. "Dad, do you ever get tired of fighting? Like, does it ever feel like nothing's changing?" Marcus smiled, setting down the book he'd been reading. "Sometimes it feels that way, yeah. But then I remember why I started this in the first place. It's not about seeing immediate results, it's about planting seeds. Even if we don't see the flowers bloom right away, someone else will water them someday." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "I guess that makes sense. Still, it must be exhausting." "It is," Marcus admitted. "But it's worth it. Every voice matters. Every action counts. If we give up, who will keep pushing forward?" Daniel smiled faintly. "You're pretty good at this whole inspiration thing, you know that?" Marcus laughed, ruffling his son's hair. Years of practice. Despite the progress, challenges remained. Not everyone supported the reforms. Some officers resisted the new policies, arguing that they hindered their ability to do their jobs effectively. Others accused the department of caving to public pressure rather than prioritizing safety. Tension simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. To address these concerns, Marcus organized a town hall meeting specifically for law enforcement and community members to come together. The event drew a large crowd, with both sides expressing fears, frustrations, and hopes for the future. Marcus moderated the discussion, encouraging honest dialogue and active listening. "This isn't about pointing fingers," he said during his opening remarks. "It's about finding common ground. We all want the same thing, a safe, fair, and just community. Let's focus on solutions, not blame." The conversation was raw and emotional, with moments of tension giving way to understanding. By the end of the evening, tentative agreements had been reached and plans were made to continue the dialogue in the weeks ahead. Though far from perfect, the meeting marked a significant step toward healing. As weeks turned into months, Kevin Doyle's transformation became more apparent. His initial awkwardness at the shelter faded, replaced by genuine engagement. He formed friendships with fellow volunteers, learning their stories and sharing bits of his own. Residents began trusting him, seeking his advice or simply chatting with him during mealtimes. One day, a young boy named Ethan, whose family had recently moved into the shelter, shyly handed Doyle a drawing. "For you," Ethan said, smiling proudly. Doyle looked at the picture, a stick figure version of himself standing beside a house labeled Shelter. Tears welled up in his eyes as he knelt down to thank the boy. "This is amazing, buddy. Thank you." Moments like these reminded Doyle of the humanity he had once ignored. They didn't erase his guilt, but they gave him purpose, a reason to keep trying. Late at night, alone in his apartment, he reflected on how far he'd come. Losing everything had been devastating, but it had also forced him to confront truths he had buried for years. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, he believed he could change. Across town, Marcus stood on stage at a community celebration, addressing a crowd gathered to honor the progress Ridgewood had made. "Change is never easy," he said, his voice steady and strong. "But it's possible. Together we've shown that justice isn't just a dream. It's something we can build, brick by brick." The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing through the park where families laughed, children played, and neighbors connected. For Marcus, it was proof that even in the face of adversity, unity could prevail. And somewhere in the distance, Kevin Doyle watched silently, his heart heavy with regret but hopeful for the future. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready to walk it, one step at a time. Months had passed since the trial, and Ridgewood was beginning to feel like a different town. The scars of the past were still visible. Whispers lingered in coffee shops. Graffiti on walls demanded justice, but there was also a sense of renewal. Marcus Johnson's efforts to bridge divides between law enforcement and the community had taken root. Regular meetings brought officers and residents together, fostering trust where distrust once festered. Slowly but surely, People began to see each other not as enemies, but as neighbors. For Kevin Doyle, life remained a balancing act. His days at the shelter became routine, almost comforting. He no longer felt out of place among the volunteers, or the residents who relied on its services. In fact, he found himself looking forward to those hours spent chopping vegetables, serving meals, or simply listening to someone share their story. It wasn't redemption exactly, not yet, but it was progress. One chilly autumn morning, Doyle arrived early at the shelter, eager to help prepare breakfast for the growing number of families seeking refuge from rising housing costs. Greg greeted him with a warm smile, handing him a steaming cup of coffee. "You've been doing great work here," Greg said, his tone sincere. "People are starting to notice." Doyle shrugged, sipping the coffee cautiously. "I just hope I'm making up for some of the damage I caused." "You are," Greg replied firmly. "But remember, healing takes time, for you and for others. Don't rush it." Later that day, as Doyle served plates of scrambled eggs and toast, he noticed a familiar face in line. It was Jordan, the young man who had testified against him during the trial. Their eyes met briefly, and Doyle braced himself for hostility. Instead, Jordan gave him a small nod before moving along to find a seat. It wasn't forgiveness necessarily, but it was acknowledgement, and that meant something. By evening, Doyle sat alone in his apartment, staring out the window as raindrops streaked the glass. He thought about how much his life had changed over the past year. He missed being a cop sometimes, the sense of purpose it gave him. But he couldn't deny the truth anymore. He hadn't been a good officer. Not really. Now, stripped of authority, he was learning what it meant to be human again, to listen without judgment, to act without prejudice. Across town, Marcus stood on the porch of his modest home, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Daniel joined him, leaning against the railing. "Dad, do you ever wonder if all this is enough?" Daniel asked, breaking the silence. Marcus turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "Enough for what?" "For fixing things, for making sure something like this doesn't happen again." Marcus sighed, resting his hands on the railing. "Nothing we do will ever completely fix everything. There will always be more work to do. But every step counts. Every voice matters. And even if we don't see the full impact of our actions today, they'll ripple outward, touching lives we may never meet." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing his father's words. "That's kind of beautiful, actually." "It is," Marcus agreed, smiling faintly. "And it gives me hope. Hope, that fragile, powerful thing, seemed to be spreading throughout Ridgewood. At the police department, reforms continued to take hold. Officers trained under new protocols reported feeling better equipped to handle difficult situations without resorting to force. Community members noticed the shift too, expressing cautious optimism about working alongside law enforcement rather than fearing them. At a recent town hall meeting, Captain Harris announced plans to expand oversight committees and increase transparency within the department. Residents applauded the initiative, though some skeptics remained. Change, after all, was slow and often met with resistance, but Marcus reminded everyone that patience was key. "We're planting seeds," he said. "Some will grow quickly, others will take years, but as long as we keep nurturing them, they'll flourish." Back at the shelter, Doyle found himself reflecting on similar themes. One evening, as he helped clean up after dinner, Rachel approached him. "You've come a long way, you know," she said softly. Doyle paused, wiping down a table. "I don't know about that. I still have a lot to make up for." "That's true," Rachel admitted. "But you're trying. That counts for something." Her words stuck with him as he walked home later that night. Trying. It sounded so simple, yet it carried so much weight. For so long he had resisted change, clinging to old beliefs and behaviors. Now he realized that growth required effort, humility, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Weeks turned into months, and Doyle's presence at the shelter grew less tentative and more natural. He formed friendships with volunteers, and residents alike, earning their respect through consistent effort. One day, Carl, the former construction worker who had first acknowledged Doyle's attempts to change, invited him to join a group project renovating part of the shelter. Doyle accepted eagerly, finding joy in using his hands to build something meaningful. As winter approached, Ridgewood hosted its annual holiday celebration. Lights twinkled in shop windows, carolers sang on street corners, and families gathered in the park to enjoy hot cocoa and music. Marcus attended with Daniel, both wearing scarves knitted by local artisans. They mingled with neighbors, sharing laughter and stories of gratitude. Nearby, Doyle stood awkwardly near the edge of the crowd, unsure whether he belonged. To his surprise, several people greeted him warmly, including Jordan, who introduced him to his younger sister. "She's been wanting to thank you for helping out at the shelter," Jordan explained, his tone neutral but not unkind. Doyle blinked in shock, then smiled shyly. "Tell her I'm glad I could help," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The encounter left him feeling lighter, as though a tiny piece of the burden he carried had lifted. Later that evening, as fireworks lit up the sky, Doyle caught sight of Marcus across the park. Their eyes met briefly, and Marcus offered a subtle nod. It wasn't forgiveness, not fully, but it was recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey they had both traveled. As the year drew to a close, Ridgewood looked toward the future with cautious optimism. Challenges remained, of course. Systemic issues couldn't be solved overnight. But the town had proven its resilience. People were talking, listening, and working together in ways they hadn't before. Marcus continued advocating for reform, knowing the fight would never truly end. Doyle kept volunteering at the shelter, determined to rebuild his life one day at a time. On New Year's Eve, Marcus stood with Daniel on the same porch where they had watched countless sunsets. Fireworks exploded overhead, painting the night sky with bursts of color. "To new beginnings," Marcus said, raising an imaginary toast. "To new beginnings," Daniel echoed, grinning. Across town, Doyle stood outside the shelter, gazing at the fireworks reflected in puddles left by earlier rain. He didn't raise a toast or make any grand declarations. Instead, he simply breathed deeply, letting the cool air fill his lungs. For the first time in years, he felt hopeful, not because he believed everything would magically fall into place, but because he knew he had the power to shape his own. Path change was messy, imperfect, and ongoing, but it was possible. And in that moment, surrounded by the hum of celebration and the promise of a fresh start, both men understood one thing. Justice wasn't just about punishment or vindication. It was about growth, understanding, and the endless pursuit of a better tomorrow.